Hello, everyone. Welcome to Gallery Teachers Masterclass. And my name is Mark Heffernan.
I'm David Byrne.
And we're going to talk to you today a little bit about exploiting text, the idea of textploitation.
Today, we're going to look at the origins of textploitation. We'll outline the 4 cornerstones of this approach, and we'll look at some practical ways of getting the most from a text. All of this is so that you are ready to exploit your own text in the classroom. A little bit about where we came from. So textploitation was born out of a shared frustration of myself and Mark's of seeing teachers having to photocopy reams and reams and reams of paper, extra resource here, extra resource there to supplement their course books. And just giving out, here's a grammar text, here's an extra text on this, here's some vocabulary, and seeing them heading into the classroom, which is these giant piles. It occurred to us that surely a text could be used for the basis of the entire lesson because all of the language, all of the skills were already there in the text. We began trying out our own lessons, swapping them with each other, getting advice from each other. We started our blog and we gradually started honing our technique into what is now textploitation. And it's something we hope will continue to develop. But for now, the 4 cornerstones of textploitation are: we assume that there is always more to be exploited in a text. Both systems and skills can be taught using a text. We suggest a little and often approach, and we encourage an overt approach to teaching. Now, what are all of these things? Well, in this session, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into all of them and give you some practical examples. But before we get going, Mark, can you tell us what do we mean by a text?
Yeah, and this is an interesting thing. So obviously, when we think of text, we tend to think of written texts. And as you can see here, you've got a typical kind of article that you might find in a course book as a basis of a lesson. Also, we'd include things like stories, but not just written text. We're strong believers that texts include any form of kind of dialogue or even things like signage that people might see. So within the kind of the lessons that we build, we look to use a wide range of texts that mirror real life, because students don't only read newspaper articles. They have things like text messages. They write short emails. They see quotes. If you are ever on social media, it's full of inspirational quotes. They also deal with things like signs. So looking at how actually texts proliferate in our daily lives, I think gives us a wider sort of remit. So we're saying that texts include, yes, all the written sources, but also spoken and listening texts. And I think it's really important that we look at that, and also that we notice that there are differences, because that can help us with some of our other work. So I guess one of the classic things that we would always ask at this point, and this is something that you could perhaps consider in the next couple of minutes, is what activities do you expect to see when you get a short sort of article in a course book? Because in general, course books will be fairly similar in their approach to text, and that's not a bad thing. A lot of what they're doing is training us to do certain things very well. But with the textploitation idea, it's this idea that you can go a little bit further than just what you would expect to see within a normal course book. But keep this idea of what you would normally see here with you for the next couple of minutes. So with this idea that there's more to be exploited, maybe we've thought about what we would see in a course book, and maybe that's been things like some gist questions. Perhaps there's been a little bit of grammar work if there's a grammar point that's repeated, and maybe there has been some vocab. Perhaps there was kind of a lexical group that naturally fitted in. Perhaps with the article that we've just seen, it was things like crime that might have been looked at. But all of us, I think, who've taught have had students who've said, oh, teacher, I want to be better at prepositions. And from my experience of observing teachers, multiple times I've seen students given lists of prepositions as if this is going to help them to use them. And it becomes almost a memory exercise, a bit like I could remember what the 9th conjugation of a verb was after the 8th, but I didn't know what it meant or how to use it. So I think when we're looking at text, this is for me my number one kind of flexi stage in a lesson. I always have a look and see what different preposition partnerships are within a text, because I know I've then got a 5-minute extension activity if I need one. So dealing with language as it occurs in a context, getting them to think about it, and then asking the questions of why is it there? What's its function? Is this a preposition acting as part of a multi-word verb or a phrasal verb, or is this perhaps a preposition that is dependent? Why is it there? What is it doing? Another big thing that gets ignored very often in course books, perhaps there's one single page, is things like punctuation, and it matters. Students who have come from a different language group will use punctuation differently until we tell them that it doesn't work like that. I'm sure all of us have had kind of bits of punctuation when we started teaching that we couldn't quite understand. And English punctuation is messy. The rules for commas are not necessarily very straightforward. Half of English disagrees with the other half over when we should and shouldn't use them. So highlighting punctuation use is really important for students. One of my favorite quick, easy activities is direct speech. Stories and articles are fantastic because they regularly feature them. And, reporting something that's there, it's a very short activity, but it enables us to say, well, okay, how would you report this? And which verb would be most appropriate if you were doing that? How are they saying this? And okay, maybe if we play around with that verb, how would that sound when we were speaking it? If I said that they were kind of shouting, or if I said that they were stating, or if I said that they claimed, is there any difference in those meanings? And getting them to think about what it means. Another reason to I would say look back at text is that we have this idea that each lesson is on its own somehow, but that's not how teaching works. We teach normally or very often the same students from week to week. And so saying, well, hold on, do you notice this? Can anyone find an example of this? We saw this last week. And can you find some modals that talk about the future? Can you have a look in the text and find an example of past perfect for me? Why is it there? So it's this, didn't we see it recently? Building on it. And this ties back to that idea that David said, one of the cornerstones, this little and often approach. So we're always looking to remind students when we see something that they've seen it before, what we used it for, what we looked at it for, because it has to be reintroduced. The idea that you spend one day on relative clauses and then they're perfect it's just not accurate. It's not how learning happens. So these constant reminders, okay, so we saw these relative clauses last week, and what can you tell me about the comma there? What does the comma tell us? How is that different from if we took that away? Okay, so it's that sort of thing that we're looking at.
I love the idea as well with this, that challenging what we've looked at before. We've all taught second conditionals, third conditionals, and given a nice rigid structure from our course books, the way it's presented. And then a few weeks later, we see a conditional in an article or a text or a spoken text that just completely disagrees with what we've taught previously, or maybe adds to it, doesn't disagree with it, but just adds to how the modal's being used. So I think it's important for us as teachers and for our students to be returning to grammar, looking at it in different ways, looking at how it's used in a different situation, so that we're not just stuck in these rigid structures.
I think that's a really good point you make with the conditionals, because very often if you're looking at text that involves something about people making plans, you get this slightly altered first conditional with the if I have finished, I will meet you later, which doesn't exist normally in course books, except it might exist in some of the texts that are there. But we very rarely teach it. And therefore, we need to highlight these things when they come up. It's all about noticing what's actually in a text. And yeah, connected speech as part of a single chunk. I think pronunciation is getting far better in course books, and we're seeing it much, much more. But it doesn't hurt us if we see, again, some of this direct speech. Okay, where would you chunk this? How would you organize this? Where would your stressed words be? And it doesn't need to be a whole lesson on pronunciation. It needs to just be a short focus on, okay, let's just remind us what we did last week. Where would you put your breaks here? Okay, record it. How long does it take? I love getting students to record how long something is spoken, because you really see if they understand it, because very often, of course, the mistaken belief is that fluency is speaking quickly, whereas in fact, depending on context, that can be the very opposite of fluency. Quite often, we're looking to speak slower. And we've already touched on this with this idea of why, but we're huge believers. And some of this, if you haven't ever looked at any Danny Norrington Davis's work, some of these ideas come from him. He's a strong believer in digging down into the grammar and kind of interrogating it, asking questions of it. Why is this used here? What's the difference if I use this tense or this tense? So kind of why is this first conditional with this perfect form? If I have finished, I will meet you. Why don't we just say if I finish? Is there a difference? There is a slight difference in getting students to think about the actual usage, because too often I think students know form. I've had multiple students who can tell me form, but they're very often unable to apply it quickly to function. And if that's the case, they're not going to see the need to use it, and they're not going to see when they might use it. So this kind of interrogation of language can be really beneficial, I think, for students.
I think it's a lovely place to start. If you're starting out on your, textploitation journey and you're not sure where to start, this question of why is a beautiful beginning. Returning to a text, a single line. Why did the writer choose this word, this piece of grammar? Why did the speaker say it in this way? Why did they stress that word? That discussion between you and your students will help develop your skills, but also theirs. So I think it's a really nice starting point.
I'd agree with that.
So Mark's looked a little bit there about systems, pronunciation, grammar, things like that. But there's more. We really believe that texts, both written and spoken, can be used to develop our student skills. And it doesn't have to be a big, long skills lesson. I think that's where sometimes we go awry. We think, right, we need to focus on this skills lesson, or maybe in our course book this is the writing skills lesson. It's about 90 minutes long. It's at the back of the book. No one's ever going to go there. So we believe we can incorporate this in by just looking at what is in the text. A few examples. One of our favorites is, why did the writer use pronouns? So looking at referencing within the text. So not teaching pronouns, looking at why the writer chose pronouns to avoid repetition. Why did the writer use one, this one, that one, these ones? Again, it's this idea of having a nice cohesive piece of writing, of avoiding repetition and just helping it to flow. So just asking that question of short, simple text, maybe just a paragraph, maybe just a sentence, can help raise students' awareness. How did the writer link the paragraphs? Again, it's this idea of linking words. We very often see them as vocabulary. Students know, I know furthermore, I know thus, I know all of these fancy words, but it's not about that. It's about having a text that is easy for the reader to follow. And so just asking the students, why did they use this linking device? Or how did they link these two sentences, these two ideas, these two paragraphs? Just again raises their awareness. A simple one, we're very often looking at texts, at articles, and just thinking, why is there no grammar per se in that headline? Why has it been completely reduced to the bare forms? Helping them to see that this is how headlines are written can help them to then understand and access headlines and articles, because I feel like students will often stop at that point. They see a headline, they go, oh my God, I don't even understand the headline. How am I going to understand the article? When really actually that can be one of the more challenging steps to get past. So just having that conversation. Maybe it's helping them, something that's very important in the world of critical thinking, assessing facts and opinion in a text. Our students are surrounded by texts on social media. They're constantly reading them on their phone. But we really need to be helping them to be able to see these are facts and this is opinion, helping them to discern the two. Maybe they can do it in their L1, maybe they can't. But this is something we need to be talking about and making sure that it transfers over from L1 and L2.
And also, it's a lot more natural. We're big fans of this because this is a way of checking concept as well, and checking that they've understood what they're reading. In a way, it's a gist task as well. and being able to say, well, okay, these are facts. They're just identifying that this is true or this isn't true. Whereas here, they're responding to that fact. And the ability to differentiate between those and see how they're written differently is hugely important. A lot of our students maybe want to go and take IELTS. They want to perhaps go and study at university at some point. They're going to need this. But as David says, these are life skills, and being able to build on those and to move forward from a text and understand how different things are written are going to help them in their own production, but they're going to help them in their daily reading. And I think a big part of what we do is about attempting to make students better prepared for when they're not in class, for the moments that we're not with them.
And that really links into our next little tip here, our next little ideas. When you've read a story or a book or a conversation or listened to a conversation, no one ever checks your comprehension in real life by saying, what did John say? Or even who said which sentence, and you put the little initial next to it. These are things that I feel like students can learn to hack. These are exam skills. These are test skills. They're not real life skills. If you put me in a Spanish placement test, I will always place higher than my actual terrible Spanish should let me, because I know how to get around texts. I know how they're tests. I know how to get around the kind of test questions they ask. But if you ask someone, who do you agree with? Who do you sympathize with? This is a real life question, and it means they need a real life skill to answer. So just returning to a text and asking this one question can really show students actual comprehension and their actual ability to engage with the text and relate it to themselves and their lives. Again, it doesn't have to be an epic lesson. It can just be a single question. And the more often you ask these, the better prepared your students will be to answer them. A few more.
And it facilitates the opportunity for them to actually give reasons and to practice some of those kind of linking words that David mentioned earlier, the things like the because, I agree with this person. And then we can look at register as well. If you're asking them to write it, they might choose not to use because, they might use as or since or due to. And we open up this possibility for more language to occur that we can then engage with. If the answer is, multiple choice, or if the answer is in which person said this, the answer is either yes or no. There's only one option. By these type of questions, yes, we're asking them for a more natural response and something that happens outside the classroom, but we're also opening up the possibility for more language to emerge that we can teach with.
Exactly. And a few more ideas of skills that we could develop. We could be just looking at a conversation. We're big fans of looking at basic structures of a conversation, basic script. Most conversations follow something. If someone asks you, do you want to go out with them tonight in the weekend, and you say no, well, that's kind of rude. But if you say, I can't because, and give a reason, that's what's expected. If someone says to you, what did you do last night? And you say nothing, that's a conversation killer. And actually, that's an answer a lot of my students have given me over the years. They have often said nothing. Yeah. But what we expect is nothing special. I just sat around and watched television. How about you? We expect the nothing, an excuse, and a follow-up question. So just giving them these micro structures, I think, can really, really help. And it's just returning to an audio and asking, what is the structure? What is the back and forth of this conversation? Again,
absolutely.
First time will be tricky. As you go through it, they will learn. How would the meaning change if I stress this word, if I stress this word? So just subtle differences, will raise awareness of intonation and how it carries meaning. In English, intonation can carry a lot of meaning. That's not necessarily true for every language. So it's important we discuss it. I quite like this one. I find I'm from Ireland. I like listening in course books to Irish accents and things like that. They're not always the best. It can be a mixed bag. But I think raising students' awareness of accents and can be something that is useful for them, depending on their context. If they plan on traveling, if they plan on working in international companies, this can be something that's quite useful. It's something students will very often say is one of their barriers to comprehension when it comes to a listening text.
And I think as an extension from that, how old are they? What do you know about them? We love questions like, what's the relationship between the two speakers? Because again, that opens up this idea of discussion of register and the language choices we make depending on our relationship to the person. And I think all of us who have taught for a while have probably had, especially written communication with students, in completely the wrong register, sometimes far too informal, sometimes far too formal. So acknowledging that the English changes in a different way, perhaps to many other languages, in that it's not primarily dictated by grammar, the register. Our register is dictated primarily by vocabulary choices. And so highlighting what that means for a reader, how we kind of soften, because too often I think register is seen as black and white, formal, informal, and it really isn't. I can write a letter, or I don't write letters. Well, actually I do, but I can write text messages to my friends, someone like David, and I can write a text message to my mom. They're both going to be informal, but they're going to have a different register. So thinking about the choices that are made and highlighting those for our students can be really useful.
100%. So I think this one is very nice. What did you not hear in this sentence? This can really, really help with listening skills. So giving students the audio script, playing the audio again, saying, what are you not hearing? And then discussing why that is. This is just a really simple step to raising awareness of weak forms, of maybe linking. It just really helps students to see why they're not hearing something, because very often their assumption is my listening skills are bad. And that's not true. It's just that they might not necessarily have known something was possible. Simplest example, if you thought it was going to be, I am going to, and it's actually I'm gonna, then if you don't know the second one is possible, you probably won't hear it. It will just be a mess of sounds. So just raising their awareness gradually. What did you not hear? Oh, let's discuss that. This might be why. And then this will enable them to maybe hear it next time. A very simple question to follow any listening. So often our listening exercises are checking comprehension, testing comprehension. You got 3 out of 5. Oh, well, maybe you'll do better next time. Unlikely without a stage where we actually discuss it. So just returning to the listening text and saying, guys, what made that challenging for you? Was it accent? Was it the topic that you just know nothing about? And therefore, I might struggle with it if I came upon a conversation that was a topic I have no interest or no access to. I might not understand it or follow it. Was it connected speech? Was it some vocabulary you didn't know? What made it challenging, and how can we avoid that? How can we help you to develop and get past that? So just little questions when you return to a text, either spoken or written, can really make a lot of difference.
And this really is one of the central tenets, really, of Textploitation, this idea of a little and often approach. So it's really important that when we think about this, these are not huge lesson stages. They're little mini exercises dropped in all over the place throughout a lesson, where we just return to a grammar point, or we just raise awareness of something, or we just ask a question of the students. These don't need massive amounts of writing. These are just kind of a mini tool set that you carry around with you, and you use at appropriate points in a lesson. You look at your classroom. Obviously, at the moment, that's a little bit more difficult because we're online, but you look at a room and you know whether students have understood listening or not. You can kind of see by the way they reacted, even if they got 3 out of 5 or 4 out of 5, you kind of, you know whether they were able to follow and whether they just got lucky. And it's this idea of us then interceding at that point. It's the idea of giving them a reading task and asking them to do a particular thing, and then getting kind of feedback from them on that. So, which character do you sympathize with? It's a 2-minute question, probably leads to 3 or 4 minute discussion with a little bit of feedback. These are 5 to 10 minute stages in a lesson, but added in consistently, you'll be building in these skills that they will then have. And we're also big about this idea of discussing the why with the students. and discussing why we're doing this. And that kind of leads into the next slide, where we're looking at this idea of being kind of overt with what we're doing. We're always about trying to tell the students why we do what we do, what the language benefit for them is of doing it this way, what the skills are that we're focusing on. Because a classic example, and this is something that David and I both have seen multiple times in classrooms, let's take that listening that David said was quite challenging. And the first stage in the course book was probably a prediction task. Students very often don't see the value of prediction tasks. If they're going to have to listen, they may as well just listen, get it over and done with. We know as teachers that prediction tasks are about activating schemata, about students thinking and kind of almost opening up their vocab bank so that they can start to think of which words might be appropriate. Now, we know also that listening to check a prediction has a much higher likelihood of success than listening kind of cold. And we know this because most of us as proficient language speakers do this in the languages we're proficient in anyway. If I have to phone someone that I know is going to be a difficult conversation, I kind of rehearse it in my head, and lots of other people do too. We think about what we're going to say, we rehearse it almost, and then we go and make the call. That's exactly what we're asking students to do when we're predicting, but they often don't see it. And very often, in my experience, it's the part of the lesson that gets cut. So very often students aren't developing listening skills, they're just practicing or testing their listening ability, and that's not going to help. So we need to explain to them why that stage is there, what it's doing, and how it's beneficial. We need to explain them when we play it again, what we're doing it for, and what the extra little thing is. So like David said, okay, let's focus on which bits were difficult to hear. Okay, well, let's listen to those again and see why. Let's build in those little things, but let's be honest and open about why we're doing it. We're doing this so that you can. And you should, in a textploitation lesson, always be able to say, we are doing this so that you can. And this honest and open kind of, I think, reflective approach to teaching is what we really encourage. And students will be a little bit resistant to it at first. We've all had that, I think. But what we notice is that very quickly they see the benefit, and they are very able to then understand. And once you've had a class for a while, they'll explain it to each other. Oh, we're doing this because of this. And it's lovely. It's great to see. You don't have to explain it anymore. You can just elicit, and they'll give you the answers you're looking for.
I think that resistance you're talking about comes from not being used to having this discussion. And it's not because it's necessarily difficult, or students become conditioned or used to.
Habituated, yeah.
Yeah. Now we have some pair work where we discuss this. Now we do some comprehension questions. They're all fine. They all have merit and everything like that. But if students don't know why they're doing what they're doing, how are they going to apply it when you're not there? And that's what this has to be. We have to be linking with the outside world. We have to be giving them the skills to analyze and learn from the texts that are just surrounding them in their daily lives. So this overt approach, this extra step to not just doing the what, but talking about the why, the aim has to be to equip them with those skills for their real lives. Now, what are we not saying? Very important. We are not saying course books are in any way bad. Course books are fantastic. They are amazing. So much work has been done for you. But I suppose what happens is we as teachers and our students, we get into this habit, as Mark says, of doing the same kinds of activities over and over. We are newly qualified teachers. We are put into a classroom. We are given a course book. And in a way, the course book teaches us to teach. It teaches us what a lesson should be. And that is prediction, text, comprehension, vocab, grammar, discussion. That's basically, that's what we kind of learn to teach that way. We learned to teach grammar through using a course book. And so then that became very often the basis of our lesson. So what we're saying is course books are not bad. They're fantastic, but they're limited by space on the page. It's a double page spread for a lesson. What we're talking about is just adding in a few extra steps that will open it up a bit more and take advantage of what's already there. And there is amazing text in course books. We're not saying you need to add epic stages. So we're not saying you need to replan everything or plan a lot extra. In actual fact, we're saying you probably need to plan less, because this goes back to those to our early days. We saw our colleagues going into class with just extra reams of paper that they found in this resource, that resource, that resource. Instead of bringing in all that extra stuff, you're bringing in a few extra discussion questions and you're opening up the conversation on learning. So you don't need to spend hours sourcing texts. In fact, I would say don't do that. Yes, it's great to bring in authentic texts. I'm not anti-authentic texts, but if you already have text provided for you by your curriculum, by your course book, whatever it is, then use them, take advantage of them, exploit them. Yes, it's great to bring in extra text from outside, but I would say if you find yourself spending hours trawling the internet for the perfect text, maybe you're not spending your precious time in the right way. So yeah, you don't need to spend hours looking for text. You have them. What we are saying, you don't need to be printing out reams of paper. Little and often is enough. We need to develop their skills slowly and gradually. We don't need to bombard them with epic skills texts. There is always more to exploit in a text. So return to it, have a look. And by doing so, you are preparing your learners to exploit their own texts in the world around them. And when you start to see that, when you start to see students taking photos of ads, of signs, of texts, and bringing it in and going, look what I found. I found this example that we studied in a class last week. I found this conditional. It doesn't work. That's when you know it's really working. That's when you've bridged that gap between the classroom and the real world. And it's a beautiful, beautiful moment. So what is available for you guys? Well, obviously, there is our blog, Textploitation. There's over 100 lessons on there, and lots of blogs on development, on how to be more overt, how to exploit lessons, how to teach online and exploit text online and things like that. There is our resource book, Textploitation, which again has lessons in it. We divide it into 4 different text types, and there's 4 lessons for each text type. But also, at the beginning of each lesson, it gives you some teaching tips that help you to see how you could exploit your own texts. Whenever we suggest something in our procedures, we talk about why we're doing it. So again, you're aware and you can apply this to your own text. So as well as a teaching tool, we see this as a developmental tool as well. I think it's also important to point out that course books are limited in their space, but more and more in the industry, we are seeing some of the little questions we're talking about here appearing on the page. We're seeing more importance placed on them. So, you know, you'll see you're more likely to see these days just a little snippet of connected speech on the page or something like that. This book I want to highlight. This is a brand new book from National Geographic, Voices. And this has brought a lot of these tiny discussions onto the page. One of them, which I think is beautiful. We've talked a lot about connected speech today, but is that always the right way for a student to speak? Depending on their context, maybe connected speech will make it harder for other people to understand them. So if they're working in an international company, maybe connected speech isn't the right way to go. One of the really lovely activities I saw in this book was just very quickly after a pronunciation exercise, having that conversation. What is your context, and will you be, are you aware of connected speech because it helps your listening, or are you going to focus on that for your pronunciation because it makes it maybe more natural? So it's really nice to see these little conversations appearing in course books, and hopefully we'll see more and more and more over the years. So Mark, a takeaway task.
Yeah, so all we'd like you to take away from this session really is the desire to do one little thing. So take a text that you've used from a course book and think about all the different things we put forward, and think about one activity. And that might be That might be just highlighting some prepositions or kind of just seeing, I mean, my favorite easy activity is just, okay, here's 5 preposition partnerships. You've seen these words. What's the missing preposition? Close your books. Okay, reopen them and then find them. Get them to see if they can remember or predict, and then just matching them up. But it could be just one of those discussion questions about the why with the grammar. It could be something like just noticing some reported speech and getting them to turn it back into direct speech or vice versa. Any of those types of activities, it could be a skills development question. And just putting it into the lesson and to try and slightly take that text further, do something more with it, okay? And I think the big thing here is look at how that conversation evolves and repeat it another day, go further with it, see what good habits you can kind of generate within your students and perhaps within yourself.
That's it, because I think if you're new to this, if maybe it's a little bit daunting, lots and lots of ideas being thrown around in this session, just choose one and try it out, and then try another and another and another, and just open it up with your students, have those discussions, and see where it gets you. So a great website for ELT resources is Gallery Teachers Workshop. There are many CPD sessions there, so please go check it out.
Well, I think it's never a bad idea to use authentic text, but we definitely don't need to be sourcing authentic texts. I think there's a place for them, and they can be fantastic and they can be very motivating for students. But as we said in the talk, I think there's a huge role for the text that we're already given in course books to play, some of which may have been adapted from authentic materials. So I think, of course, all of us have that moment when we're kind of reading something that we think, oh, this is perfect for classroom. Definitely feel free to take that in, but don't think that you need to be always bringing in authentic materials for your classes for them to have validity. It's just not the case. So the first bit of advice I think I would give to teachers who are looking to do a little bit more would be to start small. You don't have to start with a kind of a whole lesson of 3 hours based on one text. That might be where eventually you end up. But I think a key thing here is working on little activities and honing your skills slowly and developing your ability to add little things into lessons. And that might be those types of reflective questions where you're asking the students for why. It might be a little change to the way that you ask your gist questions. So rather than asking those kind of in line 4, what does this person say, asking questions that are more focused on, for example, their opinion, their attitude, these more natural response questions. It might be just picking out an extra language point, a grammar point, or a vocabulary point, and just doing a little bit to get you started. And I think once you've started, it becomes easier and it will kind of snowball. But I think the most daunting thing is always starting. So think about 1 or 2 things that you think you could put into a lesson ahead of class, and then reflect on them yourself. How did they go? What challenges did you have? What challenges did they present to the students, and how next time would you do it differently if you would, or was it great and you would just do it the same again and add something else?
Well, I think it's really important that we return to texts. It's this idea of so much work has already been done in a course book or in your average sort of resource book. And by returning to it, we can help develop good habits with our students. We can ask a little bit more of the text. Maybe we can ask students to engage with the text in a way that better mirrors how they would in the real world. So by assessing it for fact or opinion or something like that, to really help provide them with those skills. So I think it's important that we're not just doing the comprehension and the grammar and the vocabulary, but that we're returning to the text for a little bit more.
For extension as well, it gives us the ability for the students to already have a context that they understand to look at the language from. And that's really vital. Language should emerge from a context, not just 10 kind of individual sentences where the language has been deliberately put into there. So I think there's a big benefit to returning to texts, because they should already have an understanding of the text when we return, and that can be massively beneficial for understanding language.
I think so often our learners aren't being told why they're doing something. It just becomes stuff they're doing in the classroom. And if we can't tell them why, or we don't tell them why, it's going to be very hard for them to link what they're doing in the classroom to the real world. Now, we think this is especially important with texts because we're surrounded by them. We're surrounded by learning opportunities at every moment, on our phones, in the streets. You know, it may be in the past you were in your country and you weren't being exposed to English or whatever language you're studying. But now with the internet, that's just not the case. With our phones, that's not the case. So if we're not talking about why we're doing something in the classroom, they're not linking it to their real lives, and they're missing out on all these beautiful learning opportunities in the real world. So I think it's important that we're talking about it. We're telling students why we're doing it, what we're doing, how it will help them. And I think as teachers, it's important for us to be doing it as well. We need to know why we are doing this activity. Why is it important? Are we doing it just because it said so in the course book, or it said so in the resource book? Or is there a real life application? Is there a real reason for it? It's something that maybe we get too bogged down in the what, and we don't necessarily step back and think of the why. So with our students, opening up that discussion helps to develop their skills. It also helps to hone our skills, our knowledge, and our way of reflecting and assessing our lessons. So I think it's really, really, really important.